I've got one question on 1483 and its implications, which we've pursued with other witnesses. You weren't any longer part of government at the time of its signature, but it defined the United States and the United Kingdom as joint occupying powers.
Yes, it did. Very unusual.
Thereby giving the United Kingdom, I nearly said burdening the United Kingdom, with equal responsibility and accountability for everything that happened under and after 1483 across the whole of Iraq, not just in the south and east. Was that a sensible decision? No other country followed as having occupying power status.
It probably made Blair feel important. I've read Jeremy Greenstock on how he couldn't do anything. It's just a very sad story. But the important thing is, I mean, we usually have a UN special representative, and in the case of Afghanistan, Lakhdar Brahimi led the consultations, and then the lawyer Jirga and all that. That was the big thing for me that was wrong with 1483.
But we did have Sergio de Mello in a
different...
Yeah, and
by the way, on that, Kofi at first refused him. The Americans kept asking for Sergio. And in the end, Sergio had become the UN Human Rights Commissioner, came back, of course, lost his life, but also was in a weak position. That normally the UN Special Representative was in a much stronger position, and the US wanted coordinator, and it was all pretty insulting and hopeless, but no one had any leverage left, and the Americans were gung-ho still at that time, and thought, you remember when Bush flew onto his silly ship and all that, they thought they'd, done well.
I've got one last question on this, just before you leave the government. Was it becoming apparent that a likely outcome through and just after the invasion would be a 1483 type UN resolution, that's to say without a UN lead, but with a role for the UN, but with a US lead? Was this something to be planned for as a realistic estimate of what could happen as the outcome?
In those scenarios that I talked about much earlier, we had military action without UN authority, the worst case scenario.
But this was not the worst case. This was the next case.
No, but all I'm saying is that's similar. Yeah. So we thought about that, but then I think we're back with me writing letters saying we need more resources then, because if you can't get and that's what the Treasury Working Party had said, the way we don't have to put money on the table is to get everybody in. If you're not going to get everybody in, you've got to come up with money. But they didn't do that either.
So insufficient or no resources available, therefore no plan.
Therefore, all we could do was our humanitarian stuff, and we and the UN system did that well.
I'm just going to ask my colleagues whether they have any final questions, and then I'll turn back, if I may, to you. Roderick.
You say that we should have allowed more time, we should have done it all through the UN. And I think you said earlier that the Russians, the French and the Germans were essentially saying that they would be prepared to agree to military action, but not at this time. But we've heard the argument from Jack Straw and Tony Blair that President Chirac had said in his broadcast at the 10th of March that they weren't going to agree in any circumstances. Prime Minister of the day, Mr. Blair, says it wasn't that they would veto any resolution, it is that they would veto a resolution that authorised force in the event of breach. Wasn't it the case that... In my view, that was a lie, a deliberate lie. I mean, at that point, if you remember Blair, he was grey and thin and under enormous strain of the failure of the second resolution. At that point, John Prescott brought Gordon Brown and him together. Gordon came in, and the strategy was blame the French and claim that they'd said they'd veto anything. And they said it at the cabinet, and I thought they can't have said that. It doesn't make any sense, because there'd been a written statement or memorandum or something by France, Russia, and I think Germany. Was Germany a temporary member or something? No, yes.
Or was it just a player because it was Germany? Saying, we agree there might need to be military action, but not yes. And of course, later, somebody sent me the whole of Chirac's statement, which was being sent out by the French embassy to those who wrote, but I didn't see it at that time. And it's absolutely clear within everything Chirac said that he's not saying never, he's saying not now. And we had Blix asking for more time and getting some success. So that was just, it was one of the big deceits, and it was the only way that they could get through to blame the French. And you remember the Americans stopped buying French fries and all that.
You say the full text of Chirac's statement was being sent out by the French embassy. I mean, did you talk to the French about it? You presumably had your own contacts with France.
No, at the time, I asked my private secretary to get me find out what the French had really said, but this was very fraught. She got me some very brief things. Shortly after I saw the French ambassador, and he said, if only Britain and France would cooperate in the Security Council, we can achieve a lot. And that France was very hurt and upset by the blaming, and that it wasn't true that they were saying never, but he'd like us to get back together, and could I get Blair to ring Chirac, which I tried to do. So, you know, that had gone down, but France wanted to get back to a relationship, but Blair said, he was going to America, and the French ambassador said, please, would you get him to ring before he goes, and that might help the relationship. But Blair wouldn't do that. He said, I'll ring when I get back. So,
I mean, the argument we heard from, I think it was Jonathan Powell, was that at this point, asking for more time really wasn't going to make any difference at all. It was effectively clear that Saddam wasn't complying. The French and the Russians, but the French in particular, had made clear that they weren't going to agree to a resolution authorizing military action. So actually, what was the point of seeking more time?
That was their line at the time, so they have to keep saying it, but it's not true. And Blix was saying, do you remember, I think people will remember, he said these are not toothpicks when he got rid of all those ballistic missiles. And I've heard Blix since, and I've read his book, of course, and he said he started off believing the word WMD, but then he was getting to the point when they were letting him break up ballistic missiles. They were saying, can you bring anything to test the desert? We think we poured things away here. Could you find out that it's gone? And he started to see he was getting some progress, and they were terrified. They started smearing Blix, briefing against Blix. They were terrified of Blix's success, because then their casus belli had gone.
But how much more time was needed?
Well, there was talk of a resolution from the Chileans asking for 45 days. I mean, people were saying, do you remember Jack Straw said, we have to deploy the troops to prevent war, to show we're willing to use it. And then they said, we've got to go now because they can't leave them sweating in the desert. Do you remember the contradiction? And in fact, you could have rotated them and brought some home, and if they'd done a bit of more preparation, it would have been a good thing. I mean, Jeremy Greenstock talked about 6 months. The point is there was no emergency. No one had attacked anyone. There wasn't any new WMD. We could have taken more time and done it right.
But there's a real point. You've got the troops deployed out there in huge numbers. You can't just rotate them, because you have to have them prepared, the right kind of forces prepared for them in the right military configurations. And you can't just leave them there indefinitely. So...
Well, I'm sorry, but they weren't ready. They've said that themselves. They weren't ready, and they hadn't faced up to their Geneva Convention obligations. And it's not just go in and bomb a few things and take over. You've got to keep order then, and they weren't ready for that. So I just don't agree. You needn't have deployed them that quickly, but given that you deployed them, you could have had much better preparation, and that would have been a good thing, and got more equipment. And you can bring people home and send them out, and they can do some training. Troops do that all the time.
But we've heard from other witnesses that this process of inspections was just allowing Saddam Hussein to jerk our strings, I think is one of the expressions that's been used. And he could manipulate it, he could conceal, he could spin it out, and he could just do this until all the pressure had gone off him.
But that isn't true. I mean, they were saying things like that. In fact, the Arab world was talking more and more about taking him out, getting him into exile, you know, getting more pressure on him, getting a resolution of the problem and him out without a war. You know, it's just not true that he was jerking any strings. He was, the pressures were mounting and mounting. Why did they agree to the ballistic missiles all being broken up? They were worried.